if y'all look at this logo, um, this is actually, I'll talk more about it. There's a story behind the actual flight demonstration team, the Thunderbirds, who tried to use this logo when they first were formed. And the 34th Bomb Squadron, which is still flying B-1s out of someplace in North Dakota, I believe. Anyway, at the time, they said, absolutely not. This is our squadron emblem. If you want to be called the Thunderbirds, that's okay, but you've got to have something else. So I just want to give a little shout out to my dad, who was a member of the 34th Bomb Squadron. And so a lot of this came from me talking to him, particularly as an adult. But my dad was a World War II Korea and Vietnam veteran. And he was originally selected for P-38s, but the Army Air Corps didn't have P-38s. So they decided, well, we'll just not send you to the multi-engine school. We'll just send you to the 34th Bomb Squadron, and you'll get your flight training there. So he arrived in February, and it's a significant date, which you'll see about in a couple seconds. February 42, and he literally had 0 multi-engine hours. And he flew 85 missions in the year he was in North Africa. So the 34th Bomb Squadron really started out as the 34th Aero Squadron in 1917 during World War I. And it arrived in France, and they decided to turn it into an Allied aeronautical instructional center, because they had a lot of pilots who were instructors before the war. After the war, they got this hot airplane in the upper right called a P-12, and then they got the P-26, which is down in the lower right, and these are actual photos. And then the B-18, which is in the middle, was right after they decided to turn them into an attack squadron and then a medium bomber squadron in 1939. They had a short period where they flew the Douglas B-23, but they were quickly exchanged for B-25Bs, and they were the first squadron to be equipped with them. And this becomes significant a little bit later in their history. So in April 1941, they started getting the first of the B-25Bs coming off the production line. And right after Pearl Harbor, they were up in near Seattle flying anti-submarine warfare missions from what now is known as McChord Air Force Base. And they actually sunk a Japanese submarine during that time. And then they sent them to Lexington Airfield, which is outside Columbia, South Carolina, to do the same thing. And right around that time, there was a request for volunteers to go fly a secret mission. And the secret mission, you need to be a co-pilot with 100 hours in the B-25, an aircraft commander who had 250 hours in the B-25. And lo and behold, of the 16 crews that went on actually flew on the mission, they actually took 18 with them. 12 of them came from the 34th Bomb Squadron and all the airplanes. And so the squadron essentially had no airplanes and was, I'll use the word decimated. They weren't decimated because they were all killed. They were just decimated because they took them all away. And as a footnote to history, my dad was there when the selection was made. And since he had all of 0 hours of mini motor time, he was clearly not allowed to volunteer. So they started, the powers that be in the Air Corps decided to equip them with the new Martin B-26. That's known as a Marauder that was coming off the production lines. What's significant about both the B-25 and the B-26 was there were no prototypes. They went from drawings to the first production models. And they were literally modifying them on the production line or on the ramp as they were literally coming off the line. Basically, they get the engines and the airframe together, push it out, test fly it. Oh yeah, we need to do this. We'll go back and fix it. So there was a lot of accidents. And I have back on my bookshelf the original pilot operating handbook that the Air Force had in 1942 for the B-26. Then I have the one that was issued in March of 1943. And the one that was issued in the first one, which was put together by Martin, was about 25 pages long. Didn't have much. The one that was issued by the Army Air Corps in 43 has a lot more stuff. But anyway, things like what we now call VMC, minimum control airspeed, for those of you guys who are not many motor drivers. was just not a well-known concept. And the B-26 had a high wing loading. It was very fast for its size. And I'll talk about more about that in a few minutes. And its VMC was right around 160 miles an hour. 140 knots is what they used, but everything in those days in the Air Corps was in miles an hour. So landings and takeoffs were pretty entertaining. Essentially, you got the runway made at 160 miles an hour, chopped the power, and landed. When you took off, you got the gear up, the flaps up, leveled the airplane up, and got to 160 miles an hour as fast as you could. If you had something bad happen before then, you essentially just pulled the throttle back and landed straight ahead. They also had problems with the electric props. And when they were getting the airplanes, they didn't have top turrets. And then they flew to Martin to get the top turrets in Omaha. And they also got these 1,000-gallon Bombay tanks, 4 250-gallon tanks. 1,000 gallons, 4 250-gallon tanks. They're put in the forward and the aft Bombays. My dad was also there when Doolittle did his first demonstration, when he took off in the B-26 with a co-pilot. And as the airplane broke ground, he cages the critical engine, which on the B-26 is the left engine. It means that you got the right engine in the torque. Cage the right engine, and you got the torque, which will roll you the other way. And proceeds to get the gear up, flaps up, accelerate to 180 miles an hour, fly around the airport, comes by the assembled crowd at about 100 feet in 60 degrees angle bank with one engine feathered, continues around, lands the airplane, taxis up, and he walks up and he says a very short phrase. Now, do you have any questions on how to fly this airplane? This is after the squadron had probably a half a dozen accidents, most of which were fatal, or people got killed in. So when they went to North Africa, they had 3 different versions of the airplane, the A, the B, and the C. And the big differences, besides the maximum takeoff weight, was the wingspan was extended 6 feet in the B model. And the other big change was adding 50 caliber machine guns. So the A model didn't have any package guns. The B model had two 50 cal machine guns and a powered turret in the tail. And the C model had the package guns on the side of the nose, just below the pilot's seat, or feet rather. And so what happened is the empty weight kept going up and the airspeed kept coming down. So the A models would easily cruise at 275 knots, which is pretty fast. But by the time you got to the C's, your cruising speed was 233 knots or 235 knots, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so this presented an interesting problem on level bombing runs, because you had 3 different airplanes in a formation that could basically cruise with different power settings, the same power settings at different airspeeds. So this is the cockpit of a B-26. This is an A model. It happens to be Kermit Weeks is in The Fantasy of Flight. I want you to notice a couple unusual things about this cockpit. Number one, there's no rudder pedals for the co-pilot. Okay, so this means that if the pilot is incapacitated, you have to get him out of the seat so that you can stop the airplane on landing and actually use the rudder pedals. So that was primarily the role of the bombardier navigator radio operator. So the squadron didn't have officer bombardiers. Most of the bombardiers in the beginning were the radio operator, or they had a bombardier who functioned as a radio operator and a navigator. And depending on the mission, they either flew with an enlisted guy or an officer up the nose. But that was his primary role once they finished the bomb run, was to help get the pilot out of the seat in case he got incapacitated. So it's late October 1942. They've got a full squadron of airplanes, which is 14. They figured out the problems with the prop. It had to do with the brushes and how to adjust them and keep the dirt crap out of them. They now had the Bombay tanks in them, but nobody had ever flown with them full, much less take off with them full. And none of the crews had ever flown over water, any significant distance. And they were basically told they were flying to North Africa on a route that nobody had ever flown in a medium bomber before. And oh, by the way, this is the days before satellite weather forecasts, satellite weather, accurate wind forecasts over the middle and the South Atlantic, and no GPS or inertial nav systems, and a rudimentary autopilot. So this is the trek that they took. It took 11 days, 9,400 nautical miles. It started off at Barksdale Field, which is now Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. They essentially picked up the airplanes, last of the airplanes at Martin in Omaha with the tanks and the top turrets, and they flew them down to Barksdale, gave them the once over, filled them off, and this is the first time they took off with the Bombay tanks filled. And they flew to what's now Homestead Air Force Base, Homestead Field in those days, and they spent the night. Then the next place they went to Ramey, what's now was Ramey Air Force Base in western Puerto Rico, and then spent the night. And then they went from Ramey down to, you can see it down there, British Guiana, and that's another 1,000 miles. And what they're doing is playing around with power settings because they had to figure out what the long range cruise settings were, because Martin, all they had was estimates. And my dad would tell you, if he was still on this presentation, they were optimistic, to be polite. So this is actually the chart out of the 1943 manual. And I put this in here so you can see what it looked like. They were going to be flying at about 36,000 pounds. That's baggage, full gas, guns, but no ammunition or bombs. Well, they didn't have room for bombs. And so essentially you went in this chart and you can see the weight, you can see where the range is, the engine RPM you got to fly, which down here is 2,100 RPM, the manifold pressure setting, the fuel flow, and the estimated airspeed. And they didn't have that when they lifted off or they headed out over the South Atlantic. This came out literally in March of 1943, 6 months after they arrived. But my point is, they were still trying to figure this out. So the next part of this is the entertaining thing. They get to Natal in Brazil. That's on the tip of Brazil out of the South Atlantic. And they lost one airplane that crash landed in Georgetown, in Balaam. The airplane was destroyed, but everybody got out. And they met up with a Navy PBY pilot who was going to teach them how to fly long range over water. Now, the younger guys in here probably have never done anything with dead reckoning in their life. They probably don't know the term known era, and they probably don't have never flown long distance on time, heading, airspeed, and expect to get to a destination. Well, those of us in the Hilo community, and I think Paul probably, and the S2 community, we did this a lot. So what they did is they took off on 3 6-hour missions on sequentially in 3 days, and went out into the South Atlantic for 3.5, 4 hours, reached a point in space, and then headed back to Natal. And they learned another technique called scouting line. So let me explain what these terms are. A scouting line is a Navy thing where you essentially get airplanes roughly a mile apart. So you can go a little farther if you want. Essentially keep everybody in visual range. So the guy to my right is a mile or so to my right, and there's another guy to my left, and the squadron, in this case 13 airplanes, was stretched out over about 14, 15 miles. And it gave you a visual horizon at 10,000 feet of about 150 miles on an average day. So in other words, you could see a lot. Because so where you're going is this rock that's out in the ocean that's 35 square miles that has no nav aids except a low frequency radio range. And essentially, if you remember those, if you were on the left side, you flew an A, or if you heard an N, you were on the right side. If you didn't hear anything, you were in the center. So the idea was they were going to take off and fly heading towards Ascension Island. Now, what they did is this whole idea of known era is they knew the prevailing winds were from the southeast, which would blow them to the northwest. But they had no idea what the winds actually were at 12,000 feet or 10,000 feet. And so what they learned on those 3 trips is how to read drift on the water from altitude, and also this technique of known era. So when you get to your distance or your time at a given airspeed at a given heading, you knew which direction to turn. So when they took off on day 8, they had roughly 30 minutes of gas when they arrived theoretically at Ascension Island, theoretically about 9 hours later. As it turns out, the winds blew them farther off course. They got to the end. Joe Klein, who was the squadron leader, turned the squadron to the southeast, and they flew for about 8 or 9 minutes. And lo and behold, they spotted Ascension Island. Most of the all the airplanes landed safely. A couple of them literally had the engines quit on the runway or the taxiway. On my dad's airplane, they made it to the tactical hard stand on one engine, and as they were getting ready to go through the shutdown checklist, the other one quit. So the point of that is we because most of us on this call are naval aviators, we operate in blue water operations. Keep in mind, this is 1942, and none of the stuff that we use or take for granted is today. And I know the fast guys never saw this, but I learned to use a Mark I plotting board, same thing we used in World War II. We used it in the ASW community because we would go 150 miles from a boat at low altitude. And we all know that carriers are never where they say they are. But at 30,000 feet, it's a lot easier to spot the wake than it is at 1,000 feet if they let us get up that high. So this is the kind of stuff that these guys had. And again, they started out at 9,000 feet, and then they actually went to 12 as the fuel burned down. And that's essentially what they cruised at. So now they're in Ascension Island. They find out this little event called Torch has happened. And by the way, I'm sorry, this is Ascension Island. This is what it looked like in 1943. And it's got 50 square miles. The Nav-8 had a range of 25 miles, and the radar didn't work really well. They eventually put it on the top of this mountain, and later in the war, it had pretty good range. And oh, by the way, and here's the exciting part, is the nearest alternate was an 8 square mile island called St. Helena. That's where Napoleon was sent. And it was 800 miles to the southeast, 800 nautical. So essentially, if you didn't find Ascension Island, you were getting wet. So they're in Ascension, and they take off, head basically northeast. Africa is a little hard to miss. So again, but they use the same technique. The wind blew them to the northwest, so they turned right and they landed in Accra, Ghana. Spent the night, filled it up with gas, flew to Senegal. And the exciting thing about that is Senegal was now in Free French hands, but when they left from Ascension Island, the Free French hadn't taken over from the Vichy in Dakar. Then they flew to Casablanca, which was in Free French hands for a gas stop. And then they went to a place called Tailhookers in Algeria. And they arrived, and they were told when they checked in, they were told that to orbit an hour west of the airport, because the place had just been bombed and they had to fill the runway. None of the airplanes, by the way, had any bullets in the guns, even though they were now all mounted, which is one of the things they did in Senegal before they took off. So this is the B-26A that my dad flew across the pond about middle of his tour. Its name was Bronco. You can see the guy in the middle. There is notice the hard stand is a dirt. And this is at Tailhookers. And so this is an Air Force base, and I'll get to the other two photos here in a second. They travel with their own O Club, and that was the Thunderbird O Club. It was set up in each of the bases, the 3 bases they operated out of North Africa. So Doolittle becomes head of the 12th Air Force, and he came back and on 3 different occasions flew missions with the 34th Bomb Squadron. This happens to be one of them. My dad's aircraft commander is the guy on the far left, Joe Klein. And then the top right corner, the short guy, Doolittle, is about to pin an air medal on my dad's chest. He's the cool guy with the sunglasses. He's the only one wearing shades. Don't ask me why. But anyway, so in North Africa, they operated from 3 different air bases, at least during my dad's tour. When they left to go to Sardinia, he basically got on a boat and came back to the U.S. Was home in December and married the woman who eventually became my mother. He flew his last combat mission on October 10th, 43, and it was his 85th. You can see as the Tunisian campaign progressed, they moved from Tailhookers to Djedeida, and then after the Afrika Corps surrendered, they moved to Djedeida, and that's where they flew missions to support the invasion of Sicily. So while they were at Tailhookers, They went out on what they call skip bombing missions, and I'll talk more about these in a second. But this is the profile of the other airplane my dad flew a lot of, which was called the Coffin. And so here's how this is an A model. And the reason the Coffin is significant is it was the first bomber in the U.S. Army Air Corps that finished 50 combat missions. And so they sent it back to the U.S. and flew around on a war bond tour, and then somebody rolled it up in a ball. But you know, so you have the manual, this is an A model, so you have the manual single 50 caliber gun in the tail, the top turret with the twin 50s. The ventral position they rarely used, except on level bombing missions above 8,000 feet. It had 2 bomb bays, and for us Navy guys, the A models were delivered with shackles for torpedoes on the forward bomb bay doors, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So you had a radio operator, and then a bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and then 2 pilots. And so this is what the how the crew was allocated in this airplane. So this is the Army Air Corps' attempt to drop torpedoes. The first time they did it was at Midway. They sent 4 B-26s out of Midway to torpedo the Japanese carriers. They found the carriers. All 4 of them dropped their torpedoes. Only 2 of them made it back, both of which were junk. And they scored 2 hits according to Japanese records, but the problem was neither of the torpedoes exploded, which is a problem we had with torpedoes. The 34th, when it went off to war, had never flown a skip bombing mission or dropped a torpedo or even carried one or even knew what to do. So they started reading stuff from the 5th Air Force and from the Brits to figure out how to do this. So it was essentially load up and go, because suddenly the powers that be said we needed to cut off the supplies to Rommel that was coming down from Sardinia and southern Italy via boat. So it's a great naval mission. So the other exciting thing about the Navy torpedoes in those days, you had to drop at 120 knots. So that meant you were down below VMC. So that was another reason they decided this was not really good. Strangely enough, the Brits, you kept using the torpedo, the B-26 as Marauder 2s and off Crete and in Greece with great effect. The British torpedo could be dropped at 160 knots. So they would slow up. So anyway, so this is the profile of a skip bombing mission. And they call them sea sweeps in those days. At least that was the Army Air Corps. They were relatively short missions. It took off from either either Telegrama or Sadrada. And they'd climb up, the climb power was 35 inches, 2,400 RPM, 180 miles an hour, climbed up to about 5,000 to 8,000 feet and headed out into the Mediterranean to where they thought the convoy would be. Now, the convoys were gathering either near what we call Sigonella today, or in the arch off the Italian port of Taranto rather. So from Sigonella, it's about a 10-hour steam at 6 to 8 knots to Tunisia or Tunis. From Taranto, it's about another couple of hours, depending on the speed of the convoy. And from that point on, they are vulnerable. And the ME-109s and the FW-190s and the Mach-Es couldn't come out in the middle of the ocean, so they were sending out ME-110s and Ju-88s that were armed with cannon to shoot down the skip bombers. Well, we didn't have any fighter cover either because the P-38s were having problems. But eventually they started sending out P-38s. So they'd fly up to about 5,000 to 8,000 feet. They'd spot the convoy, again, using the scouting line, good Navy technique. And at which point the squadron leader would say, you would pick off this ship, you take this ship, et cetera, et cetera. They would focus on the transports, although occasionally they had more airplanes than transports. So some poor guys got lucky and got to do the destroyers and cruisers. And at which point you nose the B-26 over and let her rip. They would come down at 320, 340 miles an hour or faster, down to about 200 feet. At which point you ease the airplane out or level it off. And essentially it's decelerating at this point. But you're at full military power, 2,400 RPM, whatever manifold pressure you get out of the thing. And it would slow up to about 280 to 300 miles an hour. And then you ease it down again with no radar altimeter to 75 to 100 feet. And as you approach the enemy freighter, what you did is you aimed head of the bow, and the pilot would then yaw the B-26 or skid it to the side to left, or typically left because the boats are coming south and they were coming from the west. And with the idea being is with the interval armor set at a second apart, the 500-pound bombs would come out of the bomb bay a second apart, skip 2 or 3 times, and plow into the side of the ship about the time you popped over the masthead. So the bombardier, he had 2 purposes in life. He'd open and close the bomb bay doors, and he'd spray the deck with his 50 caliber machine gun. That was the only thing he did. The pilots would then obviously fly the airplane. The tail gunner had 2 roles: one, spray the deck as you popped over it, and the other thing to take photographs to document any hits. They would typically, out of 4 bombs, get 2 to 3 hits. And 500-pound bomb that comes in through the deck or the side of a freighter and explodes is generally fatal. And they had great success. And their loss rate on this thing was pretty low. And they'd pop over the ship about 100 feet over the mast and drop back down to the water, and the speed of heat till they got a couple miles from the convoy. Then they climb up, rejoin, and head back. My dad would tell you that they felt a lot safer doing this than the level bombing, and I'll explain why in a second. So this is a skip bombing mission. It was climb, dive, go as fast as you can, strafe and drop your bombs, pop over the ship, and head home. So from Djedeida, after the Afrika Corps surrendered, they were focused on targets in Sardinia and Sicily and southern Italy, and an Italian base called an island called Pantelleria, which is the Italians like to call it their Malta. It was much smaller but pretty heavily defended, and they did literally bomb the crap out of it. But most of the work they did was on bridges and troop compounds and marshalling yards to prevent the Wehrmacht from moving troops into Sicily and then ultimately into southern Italy. The missions were a lot different. They would take off. This is the traditional medium bomber mission as envisioned during World War II, which is they fly based on weather and winds and the target between 7,000 and 12,000 feet. And the missions would go about 6 to 7 hours. Again, they climb up, level off, and then they would typically let the slowest airplanes set the pace. So if you were flying a C model and you can only make 230 miles an hour, that's how fast they went. If it was all A's, you're probably in the 260, 270 mile an hour range. The other exciting thing is what would happen is about the time they'd cross over Sicily or into Italy, they'd start seeing Italian fighters or German fighters, and the first thing they would do is level off at their altitude, and then they'd peel off. What they were doing was radioing the flak batteries their altitude. So as soon as that happened, they would change altitude by about 500 to 1,000 feet. They had some squadron COs who wouldn't do that. And Joe Klein had been injured at this point, and his successor was one. When Klein came back, he said, "Oh yeah, we're going to change up and down. We don't care. We're just not going to make it easy." The other exciting thing is about that time, the fighters would reappear. And so imagine yourself sitting in the cockpit, fat, dumb, and happy, straight and level, 12,000 feet, and you can see the fighters rolling in on you. You can see the gun flashes, and you can see the tracers coming down out of the guns, and you're just sitting there and taking it. I had a conversation with my dad about this when I was a young naval aviator, in fact, when I was a teenager, and then again when I was a young naval aviator, and I said, "Dad, what could you do?" He said, "Well, he just had to sit there and take it." I said, "Why?" He said, "We didn't know any of that better, and we couldn't do anything about it." So fast forward 1970, Vietnam, I'm sitting in a hover, people are shooting at me, and what can I do? Not a damn thing but sit there and take it. So some things just never change. But their bomb load was typically either, again, 400 or 500 pounders, or as you can see at the bottom, 10 250s or 2,100 pound bombs. They rarely carried incendiaries. Most of the bombs they kept, most of the time, it was 10 250s. So this is a little bit about the B-26, and I want to start changing perceptions. These are both 17th Bomb Group aircraft, or excuse me, 17th Bomb Group, 34th Bomb Squadron airplanes. Returning from a mission. You notice one's got an engine caged, and the other one's got a lot of holes in the wing and after the left engine, and also in the tail. What's hanging out on the one on the right is they're getting ready to dump ammo belts. because they're obviously trying to lighten the load. But the airplane would take a humongous amount of punishment. And here's the other interesting thing. Everybody thought that the B-26 was an unsafe airplane and it had a higher accident rate than the B-25. If you go back and look at the historical record, you'll notice by the end of the war, the 26 actually had a lower accident rate than the B-25. The last B-26 was made in 1944, and if you look at the bottom chart, you can see why. It was $50,000 more than a B-25, and that's why there's a bunch more B-25s built than B-26s. And to be really honest, it turned out to be a much more versatile airplane. So here's the other thing I want to share with you is the B-26s had the lowest accident rate of any bomber flown by the United States Army Air Corps in World War II. Is less than 0.5%. So what I tell people is that it's one of the reasons I'm around. So there are 7 of these things left in the world. Only one is flyable, and that's the one at the Fantasy of Flight in Polk City, Polk, Florida. And there's a B model in the Maps Museum in Ohio, and you can see the list of them. There are 3 of them being restored, none of which are going to be airworthy. Kermit Weeks is airworthy, is flyable, but not airworthy because he doesn't maintain it as in an airworthy status. So that's the story. I want to do a quick thing for some of you who may have bought my books, and somebody may be interested. In the last month, both the Simsher Island incident and the flight of the Pawnee reached #1 on the Amazon bestseller list in their categories, which I thought was kind of cool. That's why the logos are up there. Big Mother 40 was backed that in 2012, and earlier this summer, Raid of the Scottish Coast was given that award. So anyway, just thought I'd talk about that. And now I can take any questions you want.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did they have any record of any frag damage on their airplanes on the skip bombing missions from their own bombs?
Occasionally, yes. What would happen is they had bombs that would miss the ship and skip over the ship and explode, and they'd get frag damage.
Okay.
More often than not, the bombs, one of the things they learn as part of this is to check the fins with a protractor to make sure they're straight. Because if they went down and they nose down, they would typically go in the water. If they went vertically, they'd go off.
Mm-hmm.
If they were bent some other way, they'd go stupid and they wouldn't skip or whatever. So that's why I said typically you get 3 or 4 would skip, and 2 to 3 would hit the ship.
Question, Mark, what kind of fuses did they have on those bombs? Were they contact fuses, or were they delay, or?
They are the traditional propeller, what we've seen today, and then they had an impact fuse that had a slight delay. And I've actually gotten some of the actual mission reports, and I could go back and look at it, but typically it was 1 second delay. Any other questions?
So I have a quick one for you, sir. In your dad's squadron, what was the percentage of pilots that came home?
Great question. I've never actually calculated it, but of the original 13 crews, most of them finished a full tour or came home. They only lost 16 people total in his year, and some of those were gunners, bombardiers, and stuff like that. The biggest problem they had was disease, because they were living in tents. If you've lived in the desert, you'll notice that time in the winter, particularly, it's cold and nasty. That food was rotten. My dad was not a big guy. He was down to 120 pounds when he came back from North Africa, from what I can tell. But disease, and then the other thing is, guys you get a gunner wounded, so you had to swap crews. So rarely did, after the first couple months, rarely did you fly with the same guys every time. They tried to do it, but it didn't work. And then when they started rotating guys back towards the end of his tour, it went away. But what I've been able to find is that 16 guys didn't survive the first year. 16 air crew. And that's gunners, bombardier navigators, and pilots.
So it's interesting, the whole logistics pipeline, you know, getting food and getting bombs was probably one of the most difficult things. Once you guys were established there, that probably was a tough piece.
Yes. So you can read some of the mission reports and some of the diaries, and you'll find that they couldn't fly several days or several times. Weather was a big problem in December, January, and February, and March. And the other problem they had was lack of bombs and fuel. For those of you who don't know, I'm doing an article on this. It'll probably be out sometime later this summer about the Navy's support of Operation Torch. Basically, the Ranger, the original CV-4 Ranger, and 3 escort carriers provided cap and close air support for the landings. And then Ranger went back to the States, brought back 80 P-40s, which became their fighter escort, because originally they didn't have any fighters. And here's another interesting thing. Another interesting thing is that the squadron that was assigned to fly escort for the most often was the 99th, one of the black squadrons. And the problem with the P-40 was that it couldn't keep up with the B-26 on the long legs. It would run out of gas. So the P-40s essentially would either have to meet them over the target and leave way ahead of time, at which point the Germans would come up, run them out of gas, and suddenly they went home. It was a big problem when they started early on.
So Mark, another question for you, and this is back to the flying characteristics of the airplane. So you said VMCA or VMA.
VMC.
Yeah, it's VMC. We call it VMCA, but so you said it was 160 miles an hour.
Yeah, it's about 140 knots.
Yeah. So what happens if when they lost an engine on takeoff? They had two options: either cut the good engine and try to get it stopped, or they didn't have enough rudder control. But then you were talking about Doolittle flying it on one engine. So what did he do to show him how to survive?
Well, there's a couple techniques, and obviously it depends on where you have to cage the engine. Okay, if the engine craps out at around 120 knots, and you were airborne, you basically level the airplane, let it accelerate, get the gear up, leave the flaps down as long as possible until you got to 130, 140, and then keep going. But the airplane is going to do this, okay, and you're just not going to have enough control. So the closer you get to 140, the less of the roll is. But my father would tell you is at what we now call V1, and he later flew C-54s during the Berlin airlift and DC-6s, among other things. So by that time, we all knew things like about V1, V2, and all the things that we do today. What they would do is at some point in the takeoff, once they rotated, they had pre-briefed the two guys sitting in the front what we're going to do. So if it happens at rotation, we're just going to shut the throttle and ride it out. If it happens at 110 knots, we're probably going to belly it in. If it's around past the 120, we're going to try to fly it out. Yeah, that's why I was saying the takeoff and landings where you got to 140 on takeoff as quickly as you could. So it was takeoff, break ground, gear up, flaps up, and essentially leveling off at 25, 50 feet off the runway. And because the airplane accelerated really well. I mean, it had those props were 16 feet in diameter. It had two huge props, and it had almost 2,000. You had water injection, which theoretically gave you 2,000 horsepower aside. So you had beaucoup power, even though you're pretty heavy. So it accelerated pretty well. The landings are actually where they had more problems than on takeoffs, because guys would get slow, and then suddenly they could see that they're flat or they're going to land short. Now they got to add power. Bad news. So again, the technique was to come in. They did what we would call a break approach. They call it pitch out, and they'd come around in a constantly turning pattern. And at the 180 position, they were 180 miles an hour. At short, as they're rolling out on short final, they're right at 160. And at which point, it's pull the throttles back, ease it down, and you cross the threshold somewhere around 130.
Interesting.
Need a
And you
long
said-
runway.
Yeah, so, and you said, but the accident rate was 0.5%. Is that 0.5% of all flights that they flew?
No, it's actually the combat loss rate.
Oh,
Doesn't include accidents.
okay.
Yeah, so it's the number of airplanes that were shot down. Like I say, I have pictures of other B-26s with, like the B-17 had huge chunks of the rudder. I've got one someplace of different squadron with the entire horizontal stabilizer on one side gone. There's another one with no nose compartment. The bombardiers compartment was literally blown away. And you can see where you can see blood on the, that's the reason I don't show this picture, but you can see the blood on the windscreen, and there's only one guy in the cockpit. So obviously the pilot was incapacitated. But they got it back. I mean, it was an amazing airplane. They got a terrible rap because nobody knew how to fly it. And it's kind of like we've had a few airplanes like that too in the Navy.
Hey, Mark,
Sure.
what's the difference between the B-26 and the A-26?
A lot. Yeah, the A-26, which we call the Invader, started out as a B-26 and as a replacement for this airplane. It came out in 1944. It's a lot faster. Carries about the same bomb load as made by Douglas. And those are the ones that did yeoman service in Korea. And then again, they modified them for use in Air America. As you know, the Kavanaugh has got an A model, which has got the glass nose, and you had the B model, which had the 8-gun nose and 650s and 350s in each wing, and carried rockets underneath the wings. And they flew them as on interdiction missions during Korea. Have any of you flown in Korea? Imagine going down those valleys at night in a piston engine airplane looking for targets with no night vision goggles, no GPS, no nav aids of any kind on some dark Korean night.
Hey, yeah, Mickey and I know about that, and a few others from Vietnam.
Yeah.
We didn't have GPS there either.
Yes, I know. I
Yeah,
was
but
there.
you had great bombardier navigators leading you on, John.
Boy.
Yeah, so
Does that make you feel good?
Yeah.
Thank God for the
You're doing great
A7S
there.
Corps, because they tell them
Yeah.
where the hell they were.
yeah, so with all due respect to the BNs, those of us in the helo community were never given navigation except in flight training, and when we would go off to do our thing, we had to figure it out ourselves. And like I said, I still have my Mark I plotting board, which I'm sure none of the BNs know how to use, but I know the S2 guys do. And then the other thing that we had to learn how to use, I don't have it handy, is my Mark I, my whiz wheel.
Mhm.
About the torque and things of that nature in the B-26, we had the same thing.
It's working. They don't do anything. Okay.
We had the same thing in the Tomcat. If you lost burner on the cat shot, you could not control it due to the torque would roll in the direction of the engine.